In this tutorial, we're really going to be focusing on how to create white fur. So what you're seeing right now is how I start off this course. And I talk a lot throughout this course about reflected light and color temperature. Now, there is a full YouTube video about color theory, and I talk quite extensively about color temperature in that. So if you're not quite sure what color temperature is or means, then definitely check that out after this video. To start with, before I look at the colours and getting those areas in, I would usually start with my darkest darks and my lightest lights. So you can see here I've gone in with a black and a sepia dark, the 175. Now, the reason that I do this is it helps to set up your values for the whole drawing. You can kind of measure from that point. It's a bit like saying how long or how far you're going to run. And once you've set the start and the finish, you can then pick out where the middle of the run is going to be, or the quarter distance, and where you're going to take a break. So this is very similar. We set out the start with the black, and from there we can start to figure out where the middle values are going to sit, because you can see them more easily. So in this particular tutorial, and what I usually do, I went in quite cautiously, and I knew full well that the 706, which is what I'm using right here, Stabilo, I knew it probably wasn't quite dark enough, but it's easy to take pastel darker, especially when you work in light layers as I do, but not that easy to make it lighter. So I went in a little bit lighter than I expected I'd need to finish, and then end up making it darker later on, but I also add in colour. So I basically just leave space in the tooth of the card to make sure that I can add those colours in. I work on pastelmat mostly, and the tooth is a lovely sort of velvet texture, but if you add layers that are too thick and heavy, you will fill in the tooth of the card quite quickly, which is an issue because you basically can't get more pastel to stick on top of it, and your final layer is usually the detail layer, by which point you actually wouldn't be able to get them to show up. So here I'm going in with the Caran d'Ache Bismuth White 811. This has become a recent favourite of mine over probably the past 6 months or so. I've had it for quite a while, but I've really started relying on this pencil. It's not as warm or as dark as an ivory, such as the 103 from Faber Castell or the 105 from Stabilo, but it isn't quite as bright as the Caran d'Ache Chinese White, which I do also use in this portrait. But it's, being a Caran d'Ache, a very strong and highly pigmented pencil. Really beautiful layers go down on the page, which they don't fully fill in the tooth of the card unless I want it to, but at the same time you can see the strength in that pencil. It really allows the light values to show up brightly. Sometimes if you use a slightly cheaper brand of pencil, such as the Stabilo for the white, you don't get as powerful a white on the page. Now, that isn't always an issue because you might not need to be layering the white over other layers too much, but if you do need to layer it, then you really want something that's very opaque so you can't see through it, and you want a lot of pigment in there because white can be muddied and dirtied very easily. So that's where I rely on the Caran d'Ache quite a bit. So you can see that the portrait starts to come together fairly quickly. Once the white went in, obviously it's not quite white, but almost white went in, once we've got our lightest light in, basically just going in and filling in the gaps. I do take my time with this process because when you're working on a Whippet, a Greyhound, a Podenco, anything that has really low body fat and you can see the anatomy, you do want to make sure that the underpainting is actually more detailed than normal. You'll see as I start to put on the detailed layers soon that this process is quite different to how I normally work. If I was working on something like a cockapoo, for example, where you've got very thick fur, the underpainting stage is actually more general than this. But for this one, we see a lot of the underpainting at the end because the fur is a single coat and very, very fine, and it sits very flat to the surface of the skull and all those muscles and tendons that we can see in the final image. The eye on this dog is piercing blue, absolutely stunning. That is where I do really have to leave the Faber Castell behind. They don't have a very light blue. This is their lightest blue, the 140, which you can see is actually about a mid-tone. It's quite dark. So I used a Koh-i-Noor 27. You can also use a Conte 56. And there is one from Stabilo. The name escapes me at the moment. But there is one that is a light blue, but it hasn't got quite as much pigment in it. It's not quite as powerful, which is why I didn't use it. Now, when I do eyes, and this is what you can see happening right now on screen, when I do the eye, you want to move on very quickly. So I put the eyeball in, but it feels quite flat at the moment. It doesn't feel quite right. And for the eye to feel finished and 3D and believable, you really need to start putting the eye socket in around it, which is what I'm doing here. This is so important because it allows the eye to sit backwards into the skull. We need to create a space for it effectively so that it feels as though it is part of the face and it's sat in there and it's round. If you just focus all your attention on making a beautiful iris and really deep pupil and get all those lovely details in, then as much as it might look really great, it won't actually feel finished in 3D until you've put the orbit around it. And that's where a lot of people just spend too long on the eye. They fiddle with it and overwork it and don't realize that actually if they'd stopped much earlier on, they'd have had something that felt really realistic, but they hadn't added that 3D depth with the eyelids and then of course the eye socket, which especially on this breed of dog, you can really, really see. So that's why the eye is the first area of detail. It's got a little bit of fur around it and I've really started to finish that area. It is so important. I had a lot of fun when it came to doing the ear. You see the ear has a lot of pink, and that I suppose if you were to just have a fleeting glance at this painting, you would think that there aren't very many colours in it, but you can see here I'm starting to add the colour now. So a lot of this was sort of led by the ear, by how colourful I wanted to make that. I made sure to include the same pinks as I've done in the ear around the eye. That is very important to me to try and tie these colours together. Even though in the photo you could have used very different pinks to describe each area, we want to harmonise our painting. So I made sure to mix the pinks together. And then I start to add all these purples and blues, which you might look at and think this makes absolutely no sense, she's off a rocker, but it does really work. So when we have white fur obviously doesn't have a lot of colour in it, but what it is excellent at showing you is the reflected light in a space. So what we mean by reflected light is, in any given space, you will have a direct light source. You'll have your strongest light source. So in this instance, it's sunlight coming through the open window, which is pretty common. And if it was inside with the window shut, it might be a bulb overhead. But you will also get reflected light, which is much weaker. Now, because the reflected light is weaker, you can't identify this in the brightest areas of your subject. So those areas on this dog are, of course, just a white, but you will see it in the shadows. And the shadows, therefore, will take on quite a bit of colour because reflected light is coming from objects that are around the dog. Now, I can't see the entire scene, but we can see that the dog is on a blue sofa with a blue wall, and therefore it's not very surprising that we do see blue in some of the reflected light on the fur, because white is, as I say, so brilliant for showcasing the colours in reflected light. It really takes them on beautifully. We also get quite a lot of warmth because the coat is very thin, so we can see down to the skin where we have pinks and purples. And so basically, I worked my way around that area of the colour wheel with soft blues into purple and then into a mauve colour that was more kind of pinky purple. It's the 169 from Faber Castell, a pencil that I love to use and appears in pretty much every drawing that I do. And that pencil was used in the dark areas of the ear and around the eye, again, thinking about tying all of our colours together. So you can really study your photo to try and find these areas of reflected light. I tend to make them a little bit more saturated than they are in the photograph, because what we're doing right now, of course, is heading over with our layer of details. And when we do this, because the dog is a grey-white, we're heading over with a variety of greys, and these will desaturate the areas. So grey is effectively a non-colour. There are lots of different ways to make a grey, and if you want to find out more about that, then do have a look at the basic colour theory video. As much as I say it's basic, there's some really good ideas in there that you might not have thought of or might not have heard of presented quite in that way. And the grey, effectively, you can think of it as though it leaches the colour out of things, it balances things. We're adding less colour to an area, and so the intensity of that purple is going to be reduced, or the blue or the pink. So basically, I know that in my underpainting, I can emphasise these colours a little bit more strongly than we can see in the photograph. And then when I put the grey on top, we aren't going to see as much of the blue, purple, pinks, and all the rest of it that are underneath. So the effect becomes muted. So really, you want to overstate them in the underpainting stage. If we didn't, and then we go over the top with our layers of detail, we might not even really be able to see very much colour by the end. And the colour is really important when you're doing light grey and white dogs, because if we were to go in just with a range of greys and whites, then actually your drawing by the end, it has this kind of flat, lifeless feeling. And the reason for that is the fact that although you might not have noticed it in the photograph, our sense of reality of what looks realistic is that when we look at an animal or an object that is white, we will see colour because of this reflected light. And so we might not consciously register it. It's mainly creatives and artists who will actually consciously notice this. However, if the brain looks at something and it's devoid of any of this really, really soft colour in the reflected light, it doesn't feel quite right. Maybe it makes us feel a little bit uneasy. We know there is something wrong with what we're looking at, even if we might not be able to put it into words. So including these colours is so important. I also don't put backgrounds on my work. It's just a personal choice. I actually just don't enjoy doing backgrounds. I find them quite boring. So by introducing reflected colours into my work, it does help bring in a sense of the surroundings. And this can be best seen with the lion tutorial, which I released a few months ago, and you can see a shortened version of that on YouTube, where I introduced a whole variety of colours, and we really get the feeling of the sun on the fur, despite the fact that I've not put a background in. It's all about reflected light in that particular drawing. So you can see that I'm building up layers here in a method that I always refer to when I'm teaching as backwards and forwards. So we've got our darker values with the underpainting, and I say darker because we don't go to our darkest value that we can see for a space. We kind of go to a middle dark. It's not the darkest dark, but at the same time, it's a little bit darker than a mid-tone. And the reason we do this is that when we go over the top with our lighter values for the details, we get a really nice contrast so that we can see the details well. But remember, we haven't gone too dark that the details get muddy, because that is an issue with pastels. Pastels love to mix together, so you do have to be a little bit careful not to end up with muddy colours or values over the top. And again, on a tangent, that's why I use Caran d'Ache now for my whites. They are particularly strong and they stay very, very clean. But once we've gone over with the first layer of these lighter values for our details, I then go backwards how I describe it, and I start to add details in, but with a darker pencil. So basically, I heighten the contrast. I kind of go in and add fine shadows that are basically, they look like hairs, and you can really see that at the moment just underneath the eye, to the right of the eye. You see that area there, which I've gone back in and made darker by adding strokes of the 708, which is a Stabilo dark grey. And then to finish it off, you go forwards again and you get a lighter value to add over the top. And the reason that I do that is to make sure that the shadows sit backwards. We don't want the shadows to be the final layer, because otherwise they look like dark hairs instead of shadows between fine hairs. So all we're doing really is pushing the contrast up a little bit like you would on your phone. If you were to take a photograph and increase the sharpness, for example, you're just increasing the contrast between your details. So you'll get a really good look at this as I head into the cheek. The cheek is an area that is full of reflected light, and because of that, there aren't that many areas which get too light with the details, but I can still add individual hairs and texture. Now, when I'm adding the hairs on, as you can see, I follow a direction, a flow. And this is so important if you're doing any kind of animal. Even if you think the fur is wiry and curly and doesn't have a direction, I promise you it does. It's just that the individual hairs themselves are all over the place. But you do want to discover that flow and direction because it really informs us what's happening underneath all the fur. And it gives us the shape of the face, which obviously in this instance is so important because the fur is very, very fine and flat to the skull. So you can see there that the fur is just flowing around from the tear duct up over the eye socket and then up over the cheek as well. I'm starting to add in the reflected light at the back of the neck there. I make it a little bit brighter than it is in the photograph, really just so that it stands out a bit more against the value of the card. If you look in the photo, that area of reflected light on the back of the neck is contrasted by the very dark blue wool, but my blue paper is much, much lighter. So I wanted that light to stand out a little bit more, so I made it a little bit brighter than I can see in the photograph. And then again, fur direction. Look as I layer this over the neck. I'm really taking my time to move the pencil from making convex to concave marks so that I can really show where the muscles are, where the throat is. And it prevents the neck, again, becoming slightly flat and a little bit unrealistic. So taking your time, really, really thinking about those details, so important. I use a whole variety of greys throughout this portrait as well. I'm constantly changing, and that is to do with the warm and the cool. So I have some greys that feel a little bit yellow, and I would describe them as warm. And then there are some greys, particularly from Stabilo, the 722, which are very cool, and they are incredibly blue. In fact, the 722 is almost identical to the paper that I'm working on. It is that blue. So although a lot of these greys from Stabilo Carbothello can be matched up with their counterparts so that the values match, their lightness matches, the blue or the yellow will be different in them, and therefore we create a soft contrast. So I'm going back in, I'm looking for areas where I want to increase the contrast by changing the color temperature, and you can really see the blues and the purples shining through at the end. I have to say, in person, the blues and the purples aren't quite as obvious as that. You can see them, but they don't jump out quite as much as they do on camera, but they have a lovely effect of really rounding out the cheek, and again, it prevents this whole portrait feeling a little bit flat and lifeless. It's very different if you've just worked with a graphite pencil, words Emily, a graphite pencil, that is very different, but as soon as you start to introduce any kind of colour, you've really got to think about your reflected light. When you put whiskers and eyelashes on, it's all about a very swift motion, and I twist my pencil usually while I do this, and it just gives me a nice curve to each of the whiskers that I otherwise wouldn't be able to get. I very carefully push the base of the whiskers in with a pencil that corresponds well to the area in the painting. It's kind of like blending them in. And then we are about ready for our final touches, which, as with any drawing, you just return to your lightest lights and your darkest darks to freshen them up. And here you go, you can see some of the details in this gorgeous portrait. So if you wanted to do the entire course, it is available on the membership, of course. And I really hope you have enjoyed just getting a bit of insight into how to do white or light grey fur